Our story is ancient yet unique, blending reality and fantasy to manifest as a stunningly beautiful young woman with a heart as hard as stone. This beauty was used by her family as bait to deceive their victims and lead them to a gruesome fate hidden behind a tattered curtain in the living room. This family will leave an unforgettable mark, and as you hear about them, many stories and films inspired by their tale may come to mind. In 1870, the U.S. Congress seized vast lands from the Osage Indian tribes in southern Kansas and distributed them to white settlers who were flocking from the east in hopes of finding wealth in the American West. Among these hopeful families were the Benders, who stood out from others due to their peculiar method of pursuing their dream. The family built a wooden cabin along the road between the towns of Thayer and Cherryvale. Though not an ideal or distinctive location, it provided a good livelihood for the family. They divided their cabin into two sections separated by a large curtain. The back served as the family's living quarters, while the front was transformed into a traveler's inn where they offered food, drink, and shelter. The family consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Bender, who were in their 50s, their young son John, and their beautiful daughter Kate. The family's origins were unclear, with some believing they were of German descent, while others disputed this. What everyone agreed on was that they were quiet and reserved, except for Kate, who was a charming and articulate young woman. She claimed to be a spiritual medium with the ability to communicate with the dead and heal the sick. Kate performed magical shows in several small Kansas towns, gaining the admiration of many men who were captivated by her tall stature and long hair. Gradually, some of these admirers began to visit the family's cabin to see her. However, like many travelers who dined at the Bender's Inn, they vanished and were never seen again. The Bender family targeted wealthy men. Once they identified a rich guest carrying money or valuables, Kate used her beauty to persuade him to stay for dinner. She seated him in a special spot at the table with his back to the curtain. While she distracted him with sweet talk and promising glances, Mr. Bender, or his son, stood behind the curtain with a large iron hammer, ready to strike the guest's head, crushing his skull and killing him instantly. They would then quickly drag the body to the back of the cabin, strip it of valuables, and temporarily place it in the cellar before eventually burying it in a small garden surrounded by trees where Mrs. Bender grew vegetables. Given the rudimentary police and communication systems of that era, sudden disappearances were not unusual, especially in Kansas, where conflicts between settlers and Native American tribes were common. Thus, the Bender family continued their crimes for 18 months without arousing suspicion. During this time, hidden graves in Mrs. Bender's garden increased. However, all things must come to an end. The family's crimes were discovered when Dr. William York, a fan of Kate's beauty who had stayed at their inn before, visited them again one summer night in 1873. The family killed him and buried his body the next day in Mrs. Bender's garden. Unfortunately for the Benders, Dr. York's brother was a colonel in the U.S. Army. Dr. York had informed his brother of his plan to stay at the Benders' Inn during his travels. When Dr. York was delayed, Colonel York began searching for him, leading him to the Bender family's home. They denied seeing his brother and suggested he might have been attacked by Native Americans, which seemed plausible to the colonel. However, he decided to stay the night at the inn. That night, after dinner, Colonel York was alone in the front section of the cabin when he noticed something shining under a bed. He found a locket containing a picture of his brother's wife and daughter. Realizing the Benders were lying and fearing for his own life, he quietly left the cabin, crept to the stable, mounted his horse, and fled to Thayer, where he went straight to the sheriff's office. The next morning, the colonel returned to the Bender cabin with the sheriff and several men, only to find the cabin completely empty. The family, sensing danger after the colonel's sudden departure, had gathered their belongings and fled under cover of darkness. The sheriff and his men began searching the cabin and the surrounding land. In Mrs. Bender's garden, they noticed freshly turned earth and started digging, uncovering Dr. William York's body, followed by several more. By evening, They had exhumed over 20 bodies and found several iron hammers used in the murders. A large manhunt ensued, with mounted groups scouring the county for the Bender family, but they were never found. Theories and stories about their fate varied. One story claimed that a group of pursuers captured the family near the state border and, taking the law into their own hands, shot all the family members except Kate, whom they buried alive, believing she was the mastermind behind the crimes. They vowed never to reveal what they had done. However, this and other stories were never proven, leaving the family's disappearance a mystery that puzzled people for decades. Many women were arrested on suspicion of being Kate, but none were conclusively identified. The true number of the Bender's victims remains unknown, as over 20 bodies were found in Mrs. Bender's garden, but there could be more buried elsewhere. The family might have committed crimes before coming to Kansas and possibly continued afterward. All that remains of the Bender family's crimes is a small museum in Kansas, featuring 3 iron hammers used in their murders.